2024 was a historic year for tornadoes in recent history, often compared to years like 2011, 2008, and 2004, as the US had received well over 1,700 confirmed tornadoes, well above average, with most of them coming from the Great Plains, aka traditional Tornado Alley, instead of Dixie Alley, which has been getting a lot of tornadoes in recent years. And to say the least, this year was a surprise, record breaker, and a dream for storm chasers. So in this video, we'll go over every notable tornado event from January to December, as I have tracked nearly every single tornado event from this year. But before we do, let's broadly explain why the traditional Tornado Alley was so robust this year. So, tornado seasons in the country are shaped mostly by climate oscillations, primarily temperature oscillations in the Pacific. So, in the Pacific, we have oscillations called El Niño and La Niña. El Niño brings warm Pacific water temperatures with a more muted jet stream, while La Niña brings colder Pacific water temperatures with a more amplified jet stream in North America, allowing for more severe weather to happen in the United States, including tornadoes. So, in our case, we started the year in a neutral phase, transitioning out of an El Niño, with La Niña coming much later in the year after spring. Because of this neutral phase in the spring, 2024 was a bit different. The tornado frequency of tornado season was shaped more specifically by small-scale regional dynamics rather than the Pacific temperature oscillations. So, these dynamics brought occasional amplified troughs into the country, from the dominating low pressure tagged along with the dominating high pressure to its north in the northern Pacific. These troughs would travel east, brought severe weather and tornadoes to the central and eastern United States. Now, again, this is a very broad and general explanation, with many other factors and smaller mesoscale features playing major roles for the frequency and location of severe weather and tornadoes. Anyways, let's get into the video. Our first tornado of the year was your average brief EF0 on January 5th, just outside of Lake Jackson, Texas. By the next day, our second tornado of the year had touched down in downtown Fort Lauderdale, Florida. But the main reason why I bring this up is because it went absolutely viral on the internet for where it was located. But during this time, the National Storm Prediction Center was noticing a potential for widespread severe weather in a few days for the Deep South. Then by January 8th, the SPC issued a Hatch 10% for tornadoes, and then by the evening, the forecasted tornado outbreak began, starting with a few weak tornadoes in Louisiana and Mississippi, but wouldn't intensify until much later in the night and early morning. Around 5 a.m. is when the storm started to ramp up, producing supercellular waterspouts in the Gulf of Mexico and tornadoes near the coast. One of these tornadoes that started as a waterspout arrived on shore and struck the coastal city of Lower Grand Lagoon, Florida, at EF3 intensity, immediately causing significant damage to homes and high-rises along the coast, mangling a warehouse, and even managed to tilt a 3-story house. Afterwards, the same supercell also produced a couple more tornadoes, including 2 EF2s. Later that day, the outbreak extended to the Carolinas, dropping an EF2 tornado that directly hit the town of Bamberg, South Carolina, with a security camera capturing the footage of an old historic building collapse. In total, this tornado outbreak had produced 38 confirmed tornadoes and caused 2 fatalities. After the January outbreak, the tornado threat for this time of year was typical, with Dixie Hatch 10% tornado outlooks producing 0 tornadoes and a few tornadoes in the Carolinas and Florida. But the next month on February 8th, a rather interesting tornado event occurred. This day, the SPC issued a marginal risk with a 2% for tornadoes in Illinois and Wisconsin, and later that evening, a supercell in southern Wisconsin produced a total of 2 tornadoes, the first one being an EF1, and the second being a quite significant high-end EF2 near the town of Evansville. However, the most interesting part of this tornado event is that these were Wisconsin's first tornadoes to be ever recorded in the month of February, and the fact that there was still snow on the ground from days earlier, making this a very rare sighting. For the rest of February, not many tornadoes occurred as typical. However, by the end of the month, the SPC issued a Hatch 10% for tornadoes near Chicagoland and the Ohio River Valley. This outbreak occurred during the night hours between the 27th and the 28th. The first tornadoes of the outbreak were relatively weak tornadoes that tattered the Chicago metro area, but would only get worse as the storm system moved into Michigan and Ohio, producing significant tornadoes, with Ohio getting the worst of it. Multiple tornadoes ravaged through the central part of the state, but thankfully no deaths occurred. In total, the outbreak produced 24 confirmed tornadoes and caused 0 fatalities. About 2 weeks later, another storm system moved into the country, resulting in a 5% for tornadoes to be issued in Kansas and Missouri. And later that night, 2 separate supercells each produced an EF2 tornado, with the first one making, in most people's opinion, the best radar scan of the year. Like, look at this cinnamon bun swirl hook echo. However, the next day was much more serious. The storm system moved east, and the expected tornado impacts were forecasted to be in the Ozarks and a lower chance for parts of the Midwest, as you can see. However, the way the tornado threat played out was very surprising. Almost out of nowhere, the environment for the Midwest had become very supportive for tornadoes, as models picked up the significant tornado potential only hours before the event, resulting in little to no time for a revised forecast. Anyways, the outbreak started with an early EF2 tornado on the Indiana and Kentucky border, and a few weaker tornadoes mostly in Illinois, but just after 5 p.m., semi-discrete supercells formed and moved eastward, and began to produce intense tornadoes. The first notable one being the Indian Lake EF3 tornado. This tornado plowed through the communities and towns on the side and the islands of the lake, resulting in 3 fatalities. Just a few minutes later, another tornado had hit the town of Winchester, Indiana. Here, a Taco Bell was completely obliterated down to its foundation, which led to the possibility of this becoming our first EF4 plus tornado of the year, but the official rating was a high-end EF3. And also thanks to the complete destruction of the Taco Bell, this led to some rather interesting Google reviews. By the next day, the outbreak ended off with a few tornadoes in the south. In all, the entire outbreak had produced 34 confirmed tornadoes with 4 fatalities. Next month on April 1st, another trough had moved into the country, bringing the threat for severe weather, including tornadoes. This made the SPC issue a hail-driven moderate risk with a hatch 10% for tornadoes. Thankfully, the day tornado-wise only produced weak tornadoes in Missouri and Oklahoma, since they were in a line of storms, with one of those tornadoes hitting the town of Barnsdall. Now, you might want to keep this town in mind for later. And unfortunately, later that night in the early hours on the 2nd, a widespread radar outage occurred across the country, making the detection of tornadoes nearly impossible. This caused a lot of worry to people, as the tornado threat was still ongoing, with a long day in store for tomorrow. Thankfully, the radars were fixed by dawn, but 17 tornadoes occurred during this outage. No one was killed. Now, on the morning of the 2nd, the SPC once again issued a moderate risk, with a hatch 15% for tornadoes. This threat was more conditional, meaning that this would only perform to expectations if the clouds in the area from the night before would clear up, providing instability to the environmental ingredients. But before the possible dangerous storms expected to form later that day, the line of storms in Oklahoma I mentioned earlier had traveled eastward and met the criteria of a derecho. That alone produced tornadoes, resulting in a record-breaking amount of tornadoes for West Virginia, with 2 of them being EF2. The day overall didn't really have anything notable happen, as the event underperformed in terms of intensity, but around midnight, a low-end EF2 tornado touched down in Conyers, Georgia. Thankfully, it wasn't as strong as initially thought, but still impactful nonetheless. And by the next day on the 3rd, the outbreak had ended, resulting in a total of 86 confirmed tornadoes that were all under EF3 intensity, and 0 fatalities. 2 weeks later on the 16th, the SPC forecasted a hatch 10% for tornadoes in the Midwest, and then our next notable outbreak occurred. This outbreak was a widespread outbreak, producing mostly weak tornadoes, with the strongest one being the New London, Iowa EF2. In the end, this outbreak had produced 31 tornadoes and caused 0 deaths. A few days later on the 19th, a very rare phenomenon happened in Alaska. An EF0 landspout tornado occurred on top of Rusty Point, just outside of Anchorage, making this Alaska's latest tornado since 2010. Unfortunately, from now on, we'll be covering more devastating tornadoes as we are entering 2024's tornado heyday, and we'll start that off with the Arbor Day outbreak. This started as a few tornadoes in Colorado and the surrounding states, but would become much worse the next day as a Hatch 10% for tornadoes was put in place for the Great Plains. The first supercell of the outbreak had formed around noon, producing quite a few tornadoes, including a long-track EF2 and the Elba, Nebraska EF3 tornado. The rest of the storms fired around 1 p.m. in eastern Nebraska, with the next notable tornado being the Lincoln Waverly EF3 tornado. This was a very photogenic tornado that caused major damage to an industrial area and crossed the I-80. After dissipating, the supercell produced a couple more tornadoes before dropping one of the most devastating and destructive tornadoes of the year, the Elkhorn, Nebraska EF4. This violent multi-vortex wedge tornado skimmed the outer edges of the Omaha, Nebraska metro in the neighborhood of Elkhorn, destroying large chunks of suburban neighborhoods, then proceeded to go through rural areas and finally dissipated after entering Iowa. But the Omaha metro was very lucky, because if this tornado was even 1 or 2 miles to the east, it could have been much worse, as you can see. And despite the devastation, only 4 injuries occurred. However, the day still isn't over. Another EF3 tornado had touched down and directly hit an airport on the other side of Omaha. Not much later, another strong tornado had touched down, and after cycling, the next tornado touched down and directly hit the town of Minden, Iowa, destroying the southern part of town, and unfortunately took the life of one. The next day would be just as catastrophic, as a moderate risk was issued for most parts of Oklahoma, with storms expected to form later that day. But it wasn't until the night hours where the tornado threat exploded. More storms formed in the late evening hours, producing many tornadoes. The first notable tornado was an EF2 that struck the town of Ardmore. About an hour later, the town of Sulphur was directly hit by another tornado, completely destroying its historic downtown, killing 1. Just before dissipating, another tornado formed and impacted the outer edges of Holdingville, killing 2. Not long later, yet another notable tornado touched down and entered the town of Marietta, destroying a Dollar Tree distribution center, which carved its path right through the warehouse, then crossed I-35, where 1 was unfortunately killed in a semi-truck. As it continued northeast on the west side of town, a Dollar General and the town's only grocery store was completely destroyed, which gave the tornado an EF4 rating. The next day would end the outbreak with many weak tornadoes in Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, and in total, the intense multi-day outbreak produced 169 confirmed tornadoes and 6 fatalities. Fast forward 2 days ahead on the 30th, an EF3 drill bit tornado in western Kansas had directly hit the town of Westmoreland, causing major damage and unfortunately killing 1 in a mobile home. Much later that night, a very rare and strange tornado event occurred, a supercell that produced rather odd tornadoes. One of those tornadoes had a very deviant track, and radar velocity was showing extremely violent rotation, indicating that this was one of the most powerful tornadoes ever seen on radar. However, if we calculate the VRA equation, this shows that the tornado was actually weaker than what most people thought, but still a significant tornado anyway. But due to the lack of damage, the NWS rated it EF1. Meanwhile, the tornado next to it was spinning clockwise, which in the northern hemisphere is very rare, as they only occur in similar situations like this. 2 days later, just outside of the town of Holly, Texas, an EF3 tornado had hit a row of houses, and another house that was completely destroyed, injuring a family of 4 that was inside. But thankfully, storm chaser Freddie McKinney, who was chasing this tornado, was in the right place at the right time to save them. The family recovered, and later was featured on Dr. Phil, making this the most wholesome story of the year. During the next couple days, models have been forecasting a concerning setup for a potential tornado outbreak. Then, a couple days later on May 6th, the SPC issued a rare high risk for Oklahoma and Kansas, as long-tracked violent tornadoes were expected. And around 3 p.m., the storms of the main event started to fire. Well, bad news for storm chasers, but good news for civilians. The tornado threat had severely underperformed. However, just after 9 o'clock, a prefrontal supercell produced a tornado northwest of Osage, Oklahoma, and quickly strengthened as it was heading straight for the town of Barnesdall, Oklahoma. Yes, this is the same town that was hit by an EF1 a month prior, and it was about to get hit again. And even worse, when the tornado entered Barnesdall, the same part of town was hit. But this tornado was obviously much worse, as the town was hit at EF4 intensity, and took the life of 2. Next in line was the city of Bartlesville. Despite Bartlesville being a rather small city, the skyline is impressive and can cause a lot of problems if it gets hit. Thankfully though, the tornado rapidly weakened as a line of storms behind it caught up, which resulted in the rest of the damage to be minor as it entered Bartlesville. But there is one piece of damage that is actually pretty crazy. A 2x4 had pinned a piece of sheet metal into the side of a hotel. The next day, the SPC highlighted a Hatch 10% for tornadoes in the Midwest. This event was quite significant as a high-end EF2 tornado had gone through a very densely populated area of Portage, Michigan. This tornado hit a FedEx warehouse and multiple trailer parks. During this, another EF2 tornado to the south received a tornado emergency, the first tornado emergency in the state of Michigan. However, this was somewhat useless due to the bad timing, as the tornado had just lifted. As the outbreak continued, the next day would be much worse, with many strong tornadoes. The first notable tornado touched down just outside of Columbia, Tennessee, and traveled east, causing significant damage to the area, up to EF3 intensity, and unfortunately ended the life of 1 person. After sunset that day, the SPC upgraded the Hatch 10% tornado risk to a surprising Hatch 15% in northern Alabama and southern Tennessee. And as forecasted, the tornado threat picked back up again and spammed tornadoes around the Alabama-Tennessee border, including 4 tornadoes in Huntsville, Alabama. Thankfully, none of them were catastrophic or hurt anyone. A little later, though, an EF3 near Hennigar, Alabama, earned itself a tornado emergency, where 7 were unfortunately injured. The last couple days of the outbreak, the 9th and 10th, weren't as bad as the days prior, with the 9th receiving quite a few weak isolated tornadoes in a widespread area, and the 10th with more of a significant tornado event in the Florida Panhandle, especially around Tallahassee, as 2 separate EF2 tornadoes battered the city, and sadly, the second one had claimed the lives of 2. And by the end of the entire outbreak from the 6th to the 10th, it resulted in a total of 179 confirmed tornadoes and 5 fatalities. As we enter the middle of May, the tornado threats and outbreaks get a lot more frequent, with little to no breaks in between, meaning that we are entering a tornado sequence. Let's start off the tornado sequence on the 19th, where a 5% tornado risk was highlighted in Oklahoma and Kansas. Despite the majority of the risk being in Kansas due to the derecho, Oklahoma was the place you wanted to be if you were a storm chaser looking for tornadoes, as a supercell near Custer City produced a very large and violent tornado, prompting the NWS to issue a tornado emergency for Custer City, Oklahoma. Thankfully, the tornado missed the town and produced another one to the north. As the supercell headed east and into the night, a few more tornadoes dropped down, with one of them being an EF2 near the OKC metro area. Thankfully, the supercell started to die as it went over the city. Fast forward a couple days to the 21st, a tornado-driven moderate risk was issued in the Midwest centering over Iowa, and around 1 p.m. that day, semi-discrete supercells started to form that began to congeal into a line of storms. The first significant tornado of the outbreak touched down east-northeast of Essex, Iowa, and plowed through rural areas, damaging and destroying only sparse structures. As the tornado continued, a new one to the south was developing and touched down south of Villisca, meaning there were 2 tornadoes on the ground for a brief moment. But this tornado was a non-mesocyclonic tornado, like a landspout, but then later, the tornado absorbed into an existing mesocyclone, becoming a true tornado. This rare phenomenon caused it to strengthen and then develop into an incredible-looking multi-vortex tornado while the first one was dissipating. If we pause and contrast it, we can really see its appearance. But despite its beautiful appearance, this tornado had become much stronger very quickly, as the tornado went through a wind farm and toppled multiple wind turbines, including one that caught on fire. But unfortunately, the worst is about to come. the tornado was headed right for the town of Greenfield and took a direct hit. Meanwhile, a Doppler on wheels nearby had captured very impressive radar data of the tornado, and a month later, the data was investigated furthermore, and it was found that the tornado had preliminary peak winds from 309 to 318 miles per hour as it was going through town, meaning that this was one of 3 tornadoes ever recorded to have winds exceeding 300 miles per hour, one of the highest confirmed wind speeds in a tornado. But unfortunately, the tornado caused 5 fatalities and 35 injuries, completely destroyed homes, reducing them to slabs, trees debarked, and copious amounts of windrowing, which is seen in this blown debris pattern. But the NWS only rated this EF4 and not EF5, the highest rating on the scale, since the scale for tornadoes is based on damage and not recorded winds, which resulted in the EF4 rating. This is because Greenfield's infrastructure isn't as well built, but if we look at the damage of this parking block, it would have taken 247 to 283 mph winds to do this damage, according to Ethan Moriarty's of June 1st calculations, which would have given this tornado an EF5 rating. But since this isn't a listed damage indicator on the enhanced Regita scale, this was still rated as an EF4, exposing more flaws of the current scale for tornadoes. But nonetheless, this was one of the most impactful tornadoes of the year. A little later, another tornado had dropped down in the Des Moines, Iowa suburbs and traveled northeast. As this was nearing the town of Nevada, a webcam just outside of the town at the intersection of 650th Avenue and US 30 had captured some rather gut-wrenching footage of the 2 semi-trucks getting hit by the EF2 tornado. Thankfully, both truck drivers were okay, but 4 others were injured from this tornado. Even though this outbreak underperformed overall, it took a chunk of this video, as this small outbreak was very eventful. 2 days later, a supercell in southwestern Oklahoma produced a very photogenic stovepipe EF2 tornado that has often been called the tornado of the year, and I can agree with that take, making this an absolutely amazing day for storm chasing. Skipping a day to the night of the 25th, we come across our next notable outbreak of the sequence. Starting in the morning that day, the SPC issued a moderate risk with a hatch 15% for tornadoes, with the threat expected to form in the late afternoon and into the night. However, the late afternoon and evening threat didn't play out as well, as only a few tornadoes produced, including the photogenic Windthorst, Texas EF1. But after dark, the tornado threat picked back up, starting with the first significant tornado, the Valley View, Texas EF3. This tornado touched down at 8:39 p.m. and traveled east. Meanwhile, people on the interstate took shelter at a nearby gas station, resulting in over 100 people inside taking shelter. Unfortunately though, the gas station had taken a direct hit by the tornado, trapping and injuring many inside, but thankfully, no deaths in the gas station. However, 7 others who were not in the gas station had died, making this the deadliest tornado of the year. Now, I put a video of the terrifying experience from the gas station in the description, but I will warn that sensitive viewers might not want to see it. After the tornado lifted, a large EF1 tornado had touched down from the same supercell. However, this tornado included a high-end EF3 satellite tornado. Yes, you heard that right. The satellite tornado was more destructive than the parent tornado, as it destroyed well-built homes on Prairie Meadow Lane and Myrtle Drive near Salina, Texas. A very rare occurrence. If this night wasn't enough already, a supercell to the north would last for hours, producing very significant tornadoes. These included the Claremore, Oklahoma EF3 that directly hit the city, unfortunately killing 2 and injuring 23, a massive EF3 near Decatur, Arkansas, becoming Arkansas's largest tornado at 1.8 miles wide, the Rogers, Arkansas EF2, and 2 more EF3s. The next day, the SVC issued another hatch, 15% for tornadoes, as the storm system shifted to the east. And I like to call this day the day of the EF3, as 7 EF3s occurred, including one that tracked nearly the same path as the Mayfield tornado in 2021, causing a lot of PTSD for some. Even worse, some places that were affected by the tornado in 2021 were hit again as the tornado crossed paths, and unfortunately, one person had passed away in the tornado. This ends off the devastating tornado sequence of the year that resulted in 247 confirmed tornadoes and 21 tornado-related fatalities. Fast forward to the 30th, a tornado emergency was put in place just south of Odessa in Midland, Texas, as an EF2 tornado touched down near the international airport, making this NWS Midland's first tornado emergency they've issued. Just over an hour later, a cell merger came through and produced another tornado, this time in EF3 that knocked over a pump jack, and thankfully, no one was hurt in this event. Less than a week later, the SPC issued 6 separate marginal risks, with one of them including a 2% tornado risk over Washington, D.C. and the surrounding areas. This was expected to possibly produce an isolated tornado, but that is not at all what happened. Multiple EF0 and EF1 tornadoes ravaged the area. It does not seem like much on a map, but this was still a significant event in a very populated area, and it was the worst in the state of Maryland since 2012. A few weeks later, a decent amount of vorticity was present in Iowa that helped produce multiple funnel clouds. However, these funnel clouds have been reaching the ground, becoming brief tornadoes. But unfortunately, this wasn't the main event of the day. Yet another surprise tornado event occurred that shocked the entire weather community. A supercell in western Nebraska that was outside of the forecasted tornado risk produced a long-track, high-end EF3 tornado that directly hit the small town of Whitman, Nebraska, with no warning. And about 5 minutes after the town was hit, the NWS finally issued a tornado warning. But of course, this made no difference. This gave the local NWS North Platte a lot of hate on social media, as this is the second time that NWS North Platte has done something like this. For the town of Whitman, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that the tornado was a lot weaker when it went through the main part of town, even though velocity on radar had strong rotation. But the bad news is that a farm south of the town was hit at a much stronger intensity, which resulted in one injury and complete destruction of most of the farm. Next up, we have Hurricane Beryl's tornado outbreak. What began as a record-breaking Category 5 hurricane in the Caribbean and the Western Antilles, Beryl eventually moved its way into the Gulf of Mexico, making landfall in Texas as a Category 1 hurricane. But the most memorable part about Beryl's landfall in the United States is the tornado outbreak. This started on the 8th of July, where several supercells marched their way through Louisiana and Texas, producing many tornadoes. This is very unusual for tropical systems, as most don't produce many tornadoes. But the next day wouldn't produce as much, but had the very strong post-tropical Mount Vernon, Indiana EF3 tornado that hit the east side of town. The outbreak continued to the next day, where a few more tornadoes occurred in New York State. In all, Beryl resulted in 67 confirmed tornadoes, with 2 tornado-related fatalities. A few days later, on the 15th, a derecho had formed in the Midwest, producing an average amount of tornadoes. But by the time it reached Chicago, multiple tornadoes scattered the metro area, including an EF1 that hit the outer edges of downtown. In total, this derecho produced over 50 tornadoes and caused no tornado-related deaths. The next day, a significant EF2 tornado had directly hit the town of Rome, New York. Despite this being an EF2, for the state of New York that doesn't get many strong tornadoes, this was a rough one for them. The entire downtown received damage, including the collapse of a massive mural on the side of a building and damage to a couple churches. Thankfully, no one was hurt. For the next while, significant tornado events were quiet, but the wildfires in California weren't. And on July 25th, the Park Fire in Northern California created massive smoke clouds that resulted in a pyrocumulonimbus cloud, which produced a fire tornado. And it wasn't just a little fire devil. This was an actual tornado that was visible on radar. These are very rare though. In fact, the first documented supercellular fire tornado was in Australia in 2003. Just a few weeks later, after Debbie made landfall in Florida, Debbie entered the Atlantic again and made landfall in South Carolina as a tropical storm. This is where Debbie's tornado threat was at its worst and produced an EF3 in Lucama, North Carolina, killing one and badly damaging a middle school. Over a month later, when devastating Hurricane Helene came by and caused major inland flooding in the Appalachian Mountains, multiple tornadoes were happening to the east, with one of them being a brief but strong EF3 tornado in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, damaging and destroying businesses. To make things worse, the year prior in 2023, the city was hit by another EF3, where 16 were injured. Thankfully, no one was hurt this time. About a week after Hurricane Helene's landfall in Florida, Milton was up next to hit Florida again as a major hurricane, and will go down in history as a very bizarre hurricane. From being one of the strongest hurricanes in the Atlantic, its creepy face on infrared imagery, and the absolutely insane, deadly, yet photogenic tornado outbreak in southern Florida, which we'll be going over. Hours before Milton's landfall, supercells in Florida began to produce tornadoes starting early in the morning, with the first significant tornado being the Fort Myers EF2. Nobody was hurt. The next notable tornado was an EF3 that went through the swamps near Lake Okeechobee. This wasn't much of a threat to humans until it hit a few houses in Lakeport, where the tornado received its EF3 rating and injured 3. But after a few hours, the tornadoes became a lot more deadly, as strong supercells began to enter highly populated areas along the coast, starting with a large EF3 tornado that was entering the densely populated suburb of Wellington. Here, the tornado damaged and destroyed homes, badly damaged a Publix in the middle of construction, and surprisingly caused only minor damage for a large portion of its path, as the tornado went through intensity stages before finally dissipating north of I-95. In all, this tornado caused 7 injuries. However, the next notable tornado would be much worse in almost every way possible. A supercell southwest of Fort Pierce produced another large and powerful tornado, moving west of the city, damaging and destroying large warehouses as it was headed right for Lakewood Park. But right before it entered town, a brief satellite tornado had occurred, which is another indication of how powerful this tornado was. As for Lakewood Park, the tornado made a direct hit, damaging and destroying houses. However, the worst part of it was when a trailer park was directly hit, where unfortunately 6 passed away, making this the second deadliest tornado of the year. To make things worse, this trailer park was actually hit by a much weaker EF1 about 45 minutes prior. In the end, this devastating tropical tornado outbreak produced 44 confirmed tornadoes, caused 6 tornado-related fatalities, and was one of the worst tornado outbreaks in Florida history. A few weeks later, the second but smaller tornado season in fall has arrived, as multiple troughs have been digging into the country, causing severe weather. And on the night of November 2nd, a line of storms would roll through Oklahoma and bring strong winds and maybe even brief and weak tornadoes. However, by the time the line of storms made it to central Oklahoma, prefrontal supercells along the line began to drop strong tornadoes. Now, the reason why prefrontal supercells produce such strong tornadoes is because they get to absorb all of the environmental ingredients for themselves to make them stronger, which is why the Barnstall EF4 tornado I mentioned earlier was so strong, while storms in a line like this have to share the ingredients with each other, so you can see why these prefrontals pose a threat to the area. At 1:20 a.m., the first significant tornado touched down in a rather rural area within the Oklahoma City boundaries and traveled northeast into a suburban neighborhood, causing significant damage to homes in the area. The tornado only lasted about 5 minutes, and after lifting, radar presentation and storm chaser observation showed another tornado that touched down near Byers, Texas. However, the local NWS in Norman, Oklahoma was understaffed this night, causing the tornado to be unwarned as they clipped the town of Byers. Sometime later, the tornado eventually lifted on the Texas-Oklahoma border. Even though the tornado lifted, the supercell was still capable of producing tornadoes, and thankfully, the NWS had finally issued a tornado warning for the storm. At this time, the supercell produced a much stronger EF3 tornado, and as it traveled northeast, it caused significant damage to the Comanche golf course and structures in its path. About 30 minutes later, the last significant tornado of the night touched down near Hurrah, Oklahoma, about 10 miles away from the first one. This one caused significant damage to rural areas in the OKC metro and injured 7. This was a long night for Oklahoma, and quite literally too, since it was daylight savings, adding an extra hour to the night. And by the time the sun came up, the damage was revealed and was devastating to see, but a true miracle that no one died. Unfortunately, the next day was forecasted to be worse. The SPC issued a large hatch 10% for tornadoes, and the crazy thing is that exactly 2 years prior in 2022, the same area was under the gun for an intense tornado outbreak. which resulted in 2 long-tracked EF4s. Today, though, wasn't as significant as most people thought, but still managed to produce a long-tracked EF2 and EF1 in Idabel, Oklahoma, which was hit by one of the EF4s in 2022, and an EF2 near Rogers, Arkansas. By the end of the outbreak, there were 22 tornadoes confirmed and 0 fatalities. Next month in December, the last tornado outbreak of the year occurred on the 28th, when the SPC issued a large tornado-driven moderate risk in Louisiana and Mississippi, as several strong, long-track tornadoes and QLCS tornadoes, which are brief and weak tornadoes that form in a line of storms, were expected. But the strong tornado threat was conditional and would only perform if the environment was favorable. And unfortunately, today shaped up to be a pretty dangerous day, as tornado watches and a PDS tornado watch were issued from Texas to Mississippi. Starting rather early in the day, a significant EF3 tornado touched down in Porter Heights, Texas, quickly causing significant damage as it traveled through rural areas. After dissipating, another supercell dropped an EF2 tornado south of Alvin, Texas, and traveled northeast. Unfortunately, this tornado killed one and badly damaged an elementary school. After lifting, the supercell dropped the next tornado near Dickinson and quickly went into the Galveston Bay, where it would remain as a very strong waterspout until landfall on the other side, where it caused major damage to the few structures in its path. As it continued, the tornado crossed the Louisiana-Texas border and finally dissipated. In all, this tornado was a high-end EF3 and traveled for about 90 miles, making this 2024's longest track tornado. But that wasn't it. While this tornado was ongoing, an EF3 tornado touched down near Dick, Mississippi, and traveled northeast, causing major damage to structures in its rural path, unfortunately resulting in 2 injuries. While this was the last intense tornado of the outbreak, and even the year, QLCS tornadoes spammed Alabama, Georgia, and especially Mississippi during the night hours, which helped make this one of the most tornado-abundant 24 hours ever recorded, at 107 tornadoes. The next day would end the outbreak and produce the last tornado of the year, an EF0 in Marysville, Ohio. And with that being it, we'll end it off here. But of course, there were many other smaller events that happened throughout the year, like the Chaser Summit tornadoes, very convenient, Ryan Hall's Little Blip Storm Evolution moment.
Every storm starts out as a blip, a little bitty blip.
The small outbreak on February 4th, the Slidell, Louisiana EF2, the downtown Buffalo, New York EF1, the Sanderson, Texas EF3, the multiple waterspout outbreaks in the Great Lakes, the iconic Mountain City, South Dakota EF2, the Janesville, Wisconsin EF2, international tornadoes like the Tonga, South Africa tornado, Typhoon Shanshan's tornado outbreak in Japan, and the list goes on. In conclusion, 2024 was the second most active year for tornadoes in the US ever recorded behind 2004. Resulting in nearly 1,800 total confirmed tornadoes, with states like Nebraska, Iowa, Texas, Oklahoma, and even Florida getting the most of them. We had no EF5s, 4 EF4s, and 43 EF3s, and only 54 deaths occurred, which is still and will always be a high number. But statistically, this is under the average for a hyperactive tornado year like 2024, giving us a sign that our technology is getting better for tornado safety. But before I end the video, this was a very big and long-awaited video that I worked very hard on. So I want to thank you all for watching, and all the people that let me use their footage and or images for this video. Them being Blue Storm Chasing, Jack Kelly, Kelton Henderson, Drew, Dude with a Camera in Alabama, Evan Freiberger, who also provided some of the music, Hawkins J, High Risk Chris, RG5 Gaming, Tornadic, Saltflax WX, and Tornado TRX. Thank you all for your help. I cannot thank you enough. And special shout out to Kyle Coxon from Critical Synoptic Solutions for helping with some of the meteorology behind the year's forecast. I also have a Discord server if you're interested in joining. And if you're a bigger weather nerd, I also have a Twitter, even too. All of that is in the description, so with nothing else to say, thank you so much for watching. Maybe like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.